Welcome to a special episode of Irish Stew. We feel it's special. Martin, why am I saying we got a special episode today?
John, and for all our lovely listeners, welcome. And this is the 100th episode of Irish Stew, which began a little over 4 years ago. And so we're doing something a little bit different today. Instead of us hosting, we're being hosted, and we are delighted to be joined in the room by our good friend, Shelley Ann Quilty-Lake. So, welcome, Shelley Ann, and we will turn over the story of Irish Stew podcast so you can ask all the questions you would want to know about making a podcast and why we do what we do.
Unfortunately, we have the pride of Wexford here to interrogate us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, gentlemen. You can rest easy. I will not swear you in. This is not a deposition.
All rise.
But I am very excited to ask you the questions that I have, and I think that the listeners will also enjoy hearing your responses to them. First of all, congratulations, John and Martin, for your 100th episode. That is an extraordinary achievement, as well as hitting the 4-year anniversary of your Irish Stew podcast. I will start out with a relatively softball question. What would both of you say has been the secret to your success in hitting this milestone?
I could lead off. Martin keeps me honest. There wasn't a collaboration. I think there's a chance it dies because somebody picks up the energy when the other one is flagging. So we committed to putting in the work. We committed to a regular schedule. We committed to putting it all out. Once we got past 10 podcasts, we were in the top 95% of all podcasts that don't last that long. And I think the other thing is, one problem we haven't had, we sometimes have a problem wrangling it and scheduling it. The guests have been great, and we have had no problem attracting really good people to talk to. And they're the key. We're bringing out their story, but they're the key.
And so would you agree, Martin, that it's both collaboration and managing to source great speakers that has contributed to the longevity?
Yeah, absolutely, especially when you have a duo hosting. You have to be able to work collectively together. And so that's been a total pleasure. And just casting my mind back to 4 years ago, I was, at that point, looking around for a partner, and I was very fortunate to cross paths with John Lee, who's very connected within the Irish American community in New York. He brought more of a Rolodex to the experience. I brought maybe a little bit more of a set of techie chops. I'd already done a small podcast, which is on a rather sad hiatus right now. It's called the Nutty Chronicles, for all you listeners that want something else to listen to. It's totally different to Irish Stew. But that experience put me in a place where I realized we could do some interesting programming. Funnily enough, just on the way into our recording space here, I was considering, how do you explain the Irish Stew podcast to everybody? And I was trying to figure out the right word. And so what I would say 4 years on is we are fortunate enough to have accomplished Irish guests. And when we say Irish, we mean big church Irish, meaning the hyphenated versions. I consider myself to be Irish American, but I was born in Ireland. Expats Irish, so like yourself, Shelley Ann, that grew up in Wexford but moved over to the United States. The diaspora Irish, meaning those that are maybe multiple generations removed. And then there's the affinity Irish, those that actually want to be Irish or just love the place. And so what we want to do is bring all of those under one umbrella. And I think we're about 80 guests in with 100 episodes. We've had a couple of repeats. I like to think that we've represented all those boxes.
And one other category is we have interviewed a few people who have migrated to Ireland. Kovri Madhavan, a recent guest, brilliant novelist, grew up in India, spent her early years in India, but her adult life largely in Ireland. And I consider her, she writes novels with a view on Ireland as well as India. And to me, she's more Irish than I am. I'm an Irish American, but she's living there. She's paying taxes. She's voting in the elections coming up. That's one other category. We've had a few people who have moved to Ireland.
Now, everyone loves a good origin story. How did the idea for Irish Stew come about?
For me, I worked for a guy named Jeffrey Hazlett for many years, and I produced his podcast. And that wasn't a technical job. That was lining up the guests and prepping him for the interviews. Got me very interested in podcasting. So I started playing around with a business plan, pretty close to what we're doing now. But I kept running into the wall of the technical aspects of it, which are really not that high. The technical barrier is not that high, but it was high enough for me. And the motivation to make it happen. And then I ran into this guy.
Yeah,
That would be you, Martin,
that would be me.
based on the finger pointing.
And just John's misfortune of encountering me and my supposed technical abilities. For me, actually, my interest in podcasting originated in the American Irish Historical Society, whose executive director, Elizabeth Stack, has been one of our guests. But this was well before Elizabeth was ensconced there. I had developed an interest in a particular podcaster, a guy called Finn Dwyer, who's also been on Irish Stew as well. I keep shouting out all these various episodes, but Finn's been on twice. And Finn had done this amazing series on the Irish famine. It's an extraordinary piece of work. It's, I don't know, 20 or 30 episodes. So if you want to know about the Irish famine, this is wonderful educational stuff. And I was fascinated by this, so I was listening to this, and then I was a little bit involved in the Historical Society, and I suggested that we bring Finn over. Management in that institution at that time wasn't particularly good, and there was a lot of humming and hawing, and nobody wanted to lay out some money, and I said, to hell with it. I'll pay for it, I'll bring him over, and I'll have him stay. Just give us a date, and we'll see what we can do. And so we brought Finn over, and we actually filled the place. The place was packed that night. There was people coming down from Washington, D.C., people from Albany, etc. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And got a lot of compliments after that from various folks within the society, and they said, this is the kind of programming that we need to be doing.
Demand was there, you saw,
Yeah.
literally.
And so unfortunately it fell on deaf ears, and I was a little frustrated at that point, and I said, you know what, I actually don't need, I'd like to have a fancy mansion on Fifth Avenue, but I don't need a fancy mansion on Fifth Avenue to host these kind of discussions. And the podcast was born of that. Just the desire to get in the room with interesting people like Finn. Accomplished people is what I like to say about our guests.
Much more accomplished than we are, is what I usually find. A recent guest we've had on twice now is Katie Coleman, an astronaut. Her level of accomplishment.
Out of this world, literally.
Out of this world. And you can talk to her for an hour and then she'll drop, oh, then when I was searching for meteorites in Antarctica, and then I needed to get my hours to qualify with my jet plane license. I'm like, oh my God, what are we doing talking to you?
But that's what's great. You bring her story to the masses. So, John, you had indicated that Martin brought technical expertise. Martin, you had indicated that John brought a Rolodex. Both of you could see that there was a hunger for the stories that you wanted to profile and air. But how did the decision come about that both of you would be the co-hosts of the Irish Stew podcast?
You know, I don't want to sell Martin short saying he had the technical know-how and that's all we needed. Obviously, if you just heard him now, he had the interest in history, and he's from Ireland, and deep knowledge of Irish history and Irish genealogy. So it was a lot more than just knowing how to push the buttons. And mine was more like I came to the Irish world strongly about 15 years ago. I started to really network more from a business standpoint. I was involved with the Irish American Writers and Artists. You were currently on that board.
And then former president of the Irish Business
Irish Business Organization. So Martin had a pretty fleshed out idea for a podcast. We had lunch together not too far from here. He talked about his idea for a podcast. I said, damn, that's so similar to something I had been thinking of. I just haven't been able to get off the ground. And it was like right there, we said, why don't we collaborate?
A meeting of the minds. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah, I think, and for me to simply say that John brought a Rolodex, I think is definitely selling him very short.
For instance, most listeners don't know what a Rolodex even is anymore.
Yeah, so. I am dating myself after all. But
I know what one is. Yeah.
John, as you will know directly from his role as IBO president, is wonderful at hosting people in public gatherings. He's got a poise and a kindness of presentation, and he's got a beautiful voice. So all of those things.
Come on, here's the voice right here on the other side of the room.
My wife says when she listens, John's got a great voice.
Oh, that's nice there.
She never says that about me, but she says about John. So maybe she's just tired of listening to me. It could be that.
Could be that.
But so in terms of why there was a duo, I can't say I thought about it that deeply.
Right.
It just seemed natural. But now in retrospect, I think there was a little bit of, we need somebody with an Irish voice, Irish-ish, which is me, even though I'm living in America for 40 years, but I still have that experience and I travel back to Ireland very frequently. So I feel like I have a reasonable grasp on what's going on back on the origin spot. And we also need, it's good to have an Irish-American voice, because one of the stated ideas in the podcast is, and we have a trailer where I said, I want to shoot the plastic patty in the head. And that was one of the goals. And I don't know if we've accomplished that, but what I meant by that at that time was that I felt Irish people were not really leveraging diaspora resources properly. There is a kind of a tension between the Irish of Ireland and the Irish of the diaspora. So if an American person shows up in Ireland and says, hi, I'm Irish, and Irish people are going, no, you're not, right? And I think that's problematic. What Irish people need to know is when an American says somebody is Irish, what they really mean is Irish American, which is a shorthand way. In America, you don't have to say, I'm Irish from Ireland. Whereas, so that's important if you're an Irish American visiting Ireland. This is like this standard rule of thumb that you want to get. But for Irish people, they somehow believe or do not believe that unless you were born or raised or whatever in the island, that somehow you are not Irish, or the Irish experience that you have is not really valid. And so what we wanted to do was try and start breaking down some of those things.
Our tagline is conversation for the global Irish nation. So we look to tease out different aspects of a more global Irish identity, not confusing the citizens of the island of Ireland, but as Martin used the term big church, bringing more people into the story. We've talked to people in, Tasmania. People don't lose that Irish connection. And thankfully, I mentioned we talked to someone in Tasmania, a poet who writes in both English and Irish. She's an example of someone who just doesn't lose that Irish connection on the other side of the world. Yeah, we tried to expand the definition and bring more people into the story. And hopefully by presenting interesting stories, engaging stories. I think that's become a term for me, is diaspora engagement. I hashtag everything we do on LinkedIn with diaspora engagement, because that's really, ultimately, that's the subtext here.
And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask what may be an obvious question. Why did you decide to name the podcast the Irish Stew Podcast? What was the inspiration?
This thing had a long gestation before it first went on air. We did a lot of planning, a lot of trial and error. I think I may have come up with the name Irish Stew, and it just seemed to resonate. We were shocked that nobody else already had it. It seemed to be like Irish Stew, a mix, a combination. In Wexford, they make it one way. In Belfast, they make it another way. In the diaspora makes it a different way. So all these different elements blend together and create like a new version of Irish stew.
I figured that because it's recognizable as a dish, but also that it's got symbolic and figurative meaning in terms of the combination of ingredients.
We like to read a lot into it.
Yeah.
I can mention one episode we had that Martin was talking about, that sense of going back to Ireland and you don't belong because you weren't born here. Is like Kate Kerrigan, who's got a show she's touring with now called Am I Irish Yet? And she grew up London Irish. And now it's cool to be Irish in London, then it wasn't. But she would spend every summer in the Mayo, and she's moved back there, and she just cannot escape the tag, oh, you're that English person. And she wrote a play about this, and we want to bring her over to perform it here. And she says it really is resonating, both with people who have been through the same experience and with her neighbors saying, oh my God, did I treat you that way? That was terrible.
That's phenomenal. And so once you had this idea that both of you had parallel and then came together and it took on a whole new life, Once you had the idea with respect to what the concept of the Irish Stew podcast would be, how did you go about effectuating that concept?
Well, I think it was simply, I remember we sat down and we started putting our heads together and saying, okay, can we get guests? And one of my questions was, I don't know if we can get guests. And so John brought that strength to it. But then what was interesting about guests going forward, it was surprising. Sometimes I will cold outreach, or John will cold outreach to somebody and say, hey, we have this podcast. We know something about your story. We'd love to hear that in more detail. Are you interested? And you will be surprised the number of people that actually say yes. I certainly was.
Yeah.
Now, I do think, let's say after we got through the first 10 episodes or so, that once you have a body of work that you can point other people to, that it makes it a little bit more easy to get guests. And the word spreads. Yes, these guys are legit. They do a nice job.
They've interviewed people I've heard of.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do is, and we tell this to our guests up front, so here's a little bit of the sausage getting made. We tell guests up front that we are not journalists. And there's a particular type of journalism that I dislike intensely, and there's way too much of it. It's what I call gotcha journalism. So you're trying to just catch somebody, trip them up,
Right.
embarrass them in some way. Now, there are some small situations, in my view, that's appropriate.
Yeah.
But that's not what we are doing.
Right.
So what we want people to walk away from the podcast is tell something of their life story, and maybe something that is particularly important to them right now, and that they can then take that and embed it on their website and say, okay, you want to know something about me? You can listen to this.
Fantastic. And on your website, and this also ties in with what both of you have said regarding the genesis of Irish Stew, you indicate that it's the podcast for the global Irish nation, featuring interviews with fascinating influencers proud of their Irish edge. If you're Irish born or hyphenated Irish, this is the podcast that brings all the Irish together. When you first started out, who were you, and I'm not talking about names, but who were you hoping to interview in terms of whether they be Irish born or hyphenated Irish people? What kinds of stories did you intend initially to profile in your podcast?
I think we've been getting the kind of guests we envisioned from the beginning, spanning all kinds of, from astronauts to archaeologists, from authors and actors and academics. I think also some people are very well known and some people aren't that well known. And I think it's the mix of guests and the degree of their notoriety. I think it's about what we envision. I don't know about you, Martin.
Yeah, I particularly like bringing people to notice that maybe are not brought to notice that much. For example, a year ago we had Ruth Carden on. I call her the Bone Lady. And she's a woman that has essentially rewritten Irish prehistory by identifying an artifact that indicated that the island of Ireland was inhabited something like 1,500 or 2,000 years earlier than had been previously thought.
Fascinating. So she wasn't an orthopedic surgeon?
Not an orthopedic.
Not those bones.
She's literally a woman that archaeologists, when they go to a site, they will excavate the site, and one of the things that generally they find is bones. So think about, you've had your dinner, there's a couple of bones, and of course a few thousand years ago, there's no trash heap, right? So literally you can just bury it outside and then you dig that stuff up. And some archaeologists have this big collection of bones and they're like, okay, what are we going to do with these? They send them to Ruth. Ruth is the person that can look at a bone and say, oh, this is a deer, this is a cow, this is a horse, yakety yak. And she is sitting in the National Museum in Ireland and she's looking at old collections of bones that were excavated 100 years ago. And she finds this one bone and it looks really old to her. And it's got a mark on it. That's interesting. So they sent it off for radiocarbon dating, and it turns out to be, I don't know, 11 or 12,000 years ago.
And the marks indicating that it was worked.
Yeah, there was butchered marks on it. That's how they know, literally a cut mark on the bone.
Yeah.
That indicates that this is a human using a tool butchering it. And so that changed Irish prehistory. She's probably not a name that's particularly well known outside academic circles, but her work has actually been quite well publicized. So it was nice to actually bring her on and put a voice behind the work. I think sometimes it's interesting to hear people tell that story.
I'll mention one unknown, I think, to a lot of people, but the very interesting perspective on Ireland was Giovanni Buttigieg. He's the ambassador of Malta to Ireland. And
In relation to Pete?
He says no. And I met him when he was the ambassador to the United Nations at a Irish consulate event. And he's like, I love Ireland. I want to be Irish. He said, I'm from the island of Malta and the Ireland of Malta. He's from a town called Floriana, where their soccer team is called the Floriana Irish. And it has to do with Irish soldiers who had been stationed there and teaching the locals football, soccer, and then at the end giving them their green jerseys. So to this day, they have a St. Patrick's Day parade. And also he had those great little observations of being in Dublin, living there for the first time. That outsider view, he was very receptive to what he saw in Ireland already, and just his sort of, he liked the weather, he thought it was nice, it was a change from the brutal sunshine of Malta, and there's a heavy Malta-Ireland tourist business that goes on. Yeah, he was a charming, unknown story, I thought.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Has the arc of Irish Stew changed over the 99 episodes?
I would say,
and if so, how?
One aspect of it is, I think, and I hope we got better at it, we were very critical of each other, or of the product. We would analyze it after we did it. What did we do wrong? What did we do right? And I think what we saw in the initial stages as the arc wasn't strong enough, we shifted back and forth a lot. And I think we would tend to maybe lose the listener, maybe lose the guest a little bit. But I think we got better at organizing our thoughts and knowing when to say, I wanted to ask this question, but it's not the right time anymore. Let's put it aside. So I think we got better at that as it went along.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is one of the reasons why I actually want to do this podcast was to actually become a better interviewer. And that is a difficult thing to do, I think. It looks deceptively easy when you see people doing it well.
Like Shelley Ann.
Exactly. Because
we still have more of the show to go.
To be good at it, you have to listen to what people are saying. Mm-hmm. A lot of times you will have a direction that you wish to go to, and you're like, okay, how am I going to get from this point, talking about whatever, to get to the next point?
And then I jump in and throw it in a different direction, right?
And so there are a number of different facets to this. So you're trying to listen well, but you're also trying to frame a question at the same time. But if you don't listen properly, you might miss something that is really core. And I can't tell you the number of times that I said to John, we missed the opportunity to do the follow-up on that. Because that sounds like a really interesting story. Now, maybe it would have been, maybe it wouldn't, but listening is probably the most important thing. And framing a question cleanly, I tend to, as you can hear, run on a bit too much at times. Trying to step back and make sure that the guest is at the front and draw them out. But on the other side, we're also trying to get a conversational vibe going. Sure. It's a learning experience.
We want the listeners to get to know us a little bit too, so they come back and...
Yeah, and I'd also say the actual duration of the podcast, I'd say originally we said let's do it 30, 40 minutes, and then we realized when we were doing it, you're underserving people's stories. Like the notion of telling somebody's story in about an hour, which is what we've fallen in on now. We rarely go over an hour because we think that's daunting to listeners when they see a podcast is more than an hour long. Although apparently it's not a problem for Joe Rogan. But what we want to do is try and keep it under an hour, but that gives enough time to explore more of that person's life. There's way too many bits, profile bits, that are 10 or 15 minutes long. And really, you can't really come. It's ridiculous. The
surface, right?
Yeah, it's ridiculous that you think you can come to the complexity of somebody's life in 15 minutes. It's just absurd. We make no apologies for being long.
One thing, maybe the secret sauce here, again, not the secret, but we do talk to people who are interviewed frequently. And those people do have a tendency to fall back onto the tried and true stories. So we like to almost unbalance them a little bit in the beginning in a gentle way by setting the stage with a thought-provoking question that they hadn't heard before and they hadn't considered before. And that kind of helps, I think, change the narrative. And now they're talking more to us rather than going back on their practice stories that they've used in previous podcasts.
And that gives you then the value added in terms of Irish Stew
for.
podcast being different
That's
from
what we
your
drive for.
competitors, dare I say. And what are the key lessons that each of you have learned throughout your 4-year lifespan of Irish Stew podcasts with respect to collaborating with each other? How has your relationship changed?
I've never really been in a super collaborative thing that I can think of like this. So there's a learning curve. You have your own idea. Martin has his own idea. Somewhere we have to find the middle ground. We're not too far apart, but we do argue. We discuss which guests, which direction, are we doing too much of this, too much of that? And we have to come to a happy medium. Martin's definitely more oriented towards the history podcasts, history episodes. I have a sense of Irish history that's probably a little better than the person on the street, but I don't know the battle and when it happened. So in those cases, I say, look, I'll be the useful idiot. I'll ask the questions that maybe the audience wants to know because they're not totally up on this either. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important because occasionally I can lose the run of myself and assume whatever I'm asking our guests is well known to everybody, and so John might pipe in and say, explain that a little bit more or whatever. So it's important to have somebody grounding you. And we both do that to each other in certain circumstances. It just depends. Let's back up a moment and say,
Give the panoramic vision.
Yeah, we use some obscure term or something that may not be immediately obvious.
Sometimes I do I'll do like for the North American listeners, what that means is, or I'll ask Martin to translate the Irish expression into American.
They are two different languages. So I learned very early on.
Yeah, so I'm the kind of the nerd of the duo, I would say. The wannabe intellectual, still failing abysmally.
And I'm the eye candy.
Pity it's not in
John,
TV.
Well, I use the word intellectual, I think, because it's on the receiving end, in many cases in America, of being something that is not aspirational. And that's not to say John isn't intellectual either, of course he is. But it's a term that I think America as a country would be better served by embracing and aspiring towards. There's nothing wrong with trying to learn lots of different things. And that's one of the joys of doing this podcast, because it forces us. We have to do preparation. So when the record button is hit, we'll have to have studied our guest and understand something about the lives that they have lived.
Read their 400-page book.
Yes, etc. It's a constant learning experience.
I had the opportunity recently to meet Katie Coleman, who's a recent episode. She's got a terrific book out now called Sharing Space. And I did little photos with her book. I asked her to sign it. She looked, wow, you really marked up this book. And I was like, yeah, I read it. So I could interview you successfully. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Excellent. And now you had touched upon, say initially, that you had perhaps individuals in mind to interview. But what goes into the process of finding, as you described, Martin, the accomplished Irish guests that you have interviewed over the past?
I think there is geography, there is gender, there is the right mix. So we can't have 10 episodes in a row all about history. So here's the thing that people tell you about a podcast. They say, go niche. And so our niche is our own, but that's not very niche. We've got 100 million people worldwide that claim Irish ancestry. And I make absolutely no apology for not going niche.
Yeah.
Okay? Because I think a lot of times our listenership enjoy the diversity. So yes, we will have an astronaut on, and the next week we might have an archaeologist on, and then after that we might have a diplomat on, or we might have a business person on. And I think between the two of us, we have a reasonable command of a number of different areas, or more importantly, a willingness to learn so we can ask questions. So
I'd say the biggest challenge with scheduling people is not getting people to agree to come on it, but actually scheduling it. I think both Martin and I are guilty of like the bright, shiny object. We have a certain plan, we're going to approach these people, then Martin goes to an event or I go to an event and I go, one of us comes back. I lined up these 3 people who I met at the party. And then people will say they'll do it, but they can't do it now. They can do it in 2 months. And then we go back to them in 2 months and we actually run out the whole schedule. Yes, we do record these. This is an exception, but relatively far in advance. We might be a month to 6 weeks or more before the episode drops, as they say in the game. But yeah, we get like a kind of a backlog. We wish we could do it every day.
That's understandable.
At least every week.
I can understand.
Right
I
now,
love stories.
Right now, we're essentially twice a month, but we are in a little phase right now where we're putting out an episode every week.
And I realize that it's no doubt difficult for both of you to pick a favorite. But is there either a favorite guest who comes to mind or a favorite aspect of the Irish Stew podcast experience that you've had that comes to mind for you?
I'd say the favorite aspect is my own nerdy thing, in the sense that I am able to satisfy my own curiosity about why people do what they do. For example, I would never have called up an archaeologist and said, tell me about your story and why you do what you do. But when you call up people and say, I have a podcast, would you be interested in coming on? That actually starts a conversation and makes that possible. In terms of favorite guests, there are a variety of episodes that I would look at. I've enjoyed pretty much each and every episode for one reason or another. Yeah. But I look back and when I think back to a couple of episodes that pop out to me, one of them was very early with a gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Hazlett that John used to work with, and he had a bit in that podcast when I said to Jeffrey, and he's like probably 6th generation American guy that lives out in South Dakota.
Hard driving marketing guru.
And then basically saying, why exactly did you get into the Irish thing? Because he'd done the genealogical thing. Explain to us why Americans care that much. And he did a 2-minute riff on that, and I said, you just need to package this up and send it off to the Irish Tourist Board, because he explained in 2 minutes exactly the importance of finding the point that your ancestor came from, walking the land, smelling the land, etc. And it was really passionate. And I was like, just my freaking jaw dropped just listening to it, because it was wonderful.
It was poetry.
Yeah, and then what I took away from that...
And then he could encapsulate it in 2 minutes.
And the one thing I took away from that was the absolute importance of rootedness. So, and that can play out in many ways, but I don't think people really get that. We need to root ourselves into different things, because people are increasingly isolated. We sit at home, we watch TV. In the old days, you would go out to the movie theater, right? You sit at home and you order your food in. In the old days, maybe you went out to the market and bought the food and brought it home and cooked. But when you're in the market, you're interacting. So the importance of rooting yourself in a community is one of the big takeaways that I've got there, that the people that I find happiest are the ones with the biggest networks. And that only comes from engaging.
I was just saying that Jeffrey Hazlett still talks about that, because he surprised himself with what he came out with. And he said,
Success you achieved.
He still says, that's the best thing I ever said on a podcast. And he's interviewed a lot. That's the best thing I ever said. And going along those, well, without naming, I've named a few podcasts along the way here that I like, but there's many more. But I like it when we get the guest who says, wow, that's a really good question, or no one's ever asked me that before, or wow, I never thought about it that way, or I've never told this story before. Those are the sort of aha moments in a podcast for me.
Where all your hard work and preparation have paid off in terms of eliciting
just
something novel.
creating the environment, however it works out.
so that the
That's
magic
that's
can
my
happen.
kind of favorite moment.
And what has surprised you the most about the global Irish community or diaspora that you've interviewed over the past 4 years?
I think the different forms of the network, the different super strong connection, very loose connection, always connected, figured out they were Irish late in life, like Jeffrey Hazlitt. It's like a web, it's like a network, and some of the lines are extremely strong, and some of them are weak, and some of them are late developing, but they're there. And from a kind of business and tourism perspective, there's a lot more to mine there. There's a lot of goodwill. They know it, but there's more out there. And hopefully we have this little small role in strengthening the connectivity of the diaspora.
What's the array of the different individuals that you've described, that you've interviewed, given the wide array of sectors that they're from, as well as the array of countries globally that they're based in, such as Tasmania? It sounds like that wide variety has been intentional on both your parts, has it?
Yeah, I think geography is something that we try to capture. Do we succeed all the time? No, and obviously being based in New York, we're very fortunate that a lot of people either come through the city or are in the city. And so there is a bias, I would say, to Irish American guests. But let's say the technology has made it feasible to interview people anywhere in the globe. So we use a piece of software that is essentially like Zoom, except it captures better fidelity audio. So if we do remote interviews, it enables us to do that. And so, yeah, I think there is this complicated story about Ireland, that Irish people, it's a small country and people will tend to travel outside that country, and they see themselves in many respects as global citizens and will settle in different places. So we've had a guest on that lives in Italy, a guy, John McCourt, who's probably one of the preeminent Joycean scholars. And he is now the provost, I believe, of the University of Macerata, which is like the fourth oldest university in Italy. And he's lived a good chunk of his life in that part of the world. And so his perspective was fascinating on the Irish experience in Italy, but also his understanding of Joyce is second to none. Yeah, we try to shake that up. Can we do more? Yeah, I think so, and we're looking forward to doing that.
One area of geography that's extremely important that we became conscious of that we hadn't gone there yet was Northern Ireland. And I think we've been able to put out some really significant episodes in Northern Ireland from the people who grew up in Northern Ireland. Jane Ferguson is a well-known, won just about every journalism award as a war correspondent. And she was from a Protestant farming community. And that's, I think, the first sort of Protestant voice we had on that from the North. We have had other Protestants on who were from the Republic or elsewhere. But we're starting to get into the Northern Irish situation, and we've really been able to expand. I once in a while we do an interview solo, and I interviewed, Martin was in Ireland, and we had set up an interview with Marcino Malor, the former Lord Mayor of Belfast. So that we're interested in exploring that part of Ireland as well. We don't want to leave that out.
Actually, that provides a perfect segue to my next series of questions. And that is that both of you recently went on a road trip to Belfast in Northern Ireland for the Irish Stew podcast. How did that come about?
The official name is Irish Stew Gets Lost in Belfast Road Trip 2024.
Is there a bumper sticker to go with that merch?
The merch, yeah. It started
If found,
off,
please return. Yeah.
Martin could probably speak to it better, but an idea of doing a road trip, exploring aspects of Ireland that were a little bit off the beaten track. The Irish Midlands was what we were looking at. It was going to be a pretty ambitious project with film and a couple of vehicles and a lot of territory. So we said, let's do a trial run here. Let's just focus on Martine's event, the Belfast Homecoming, which you are an honoree there, right?
And you too,
Absolutely,
yes.
both Belfast ambassadors. And so we decided, let's focus on that. It's a city.
Oh, smart.
We can get around easily. We can do a bunch of episodes. We got great support from Tourism Ireland there. We got the great support from Marcin and his crew at the Belfast Homecoming. And we got about a dozen episodes in the can that we have to sort through now. I think it was sort of a proof of concept that we pulled off this trip. We have good portable equipment now. We have amazing people helping us out. Michael Stewart, holds the title of the Night Czar of Belfast. He was a fantastic guide, and he introduced us to distillers and restaurateurs and other tour guides who specialize in the tastes of Belfast. It was a really good experience.
Yeah, I think what we were trying to achieve in this particular series, which will be out in January, probably towards the end of January, was create a different narrative for our listeners around Belfast. And one of the interesting things when we were at Martin's homecoming event, which was held in the Titanic Hotel right across from the Titanic Experience Museum, was I'd run into Americans and I'd ask them, is this your first time in Belfast? And some would say yes, some would say no. And the ones that said yes, I said, what did you know about Belfast before you came here? And the answer was violence and bombs. And even though there has been a fragile peace, and I would characterize now as a strengthening peace in that part of the world, the shadow and the legacy of 30 years of troubles still overhangs that. And so one of the things we wanted to say about Belfast was get people a sense of, oh, these are all the cool things that you can do in Belfast, or all the cool things that you can see in Belfast. And so you can understand the city beyond its 25-year-ago troubled history. And hopefully, you'll have to listen to it. Yeah. You'll see if you agree that we've done the city some small service.
I think my impression in Belfast is an electricity there that I don't find in other cities. Sometimes it's a tension, but there's an electricity. Another friend of mine who visited Belfast recently said, there's a lot of pent-up party demand. Folks are having a great time. The Cathedral Quarter is absolutely swarmed on the weekends. There's all kinds of cool pubs and bars and outdoor spaces, and they're having a good time. And they're, in some cases, I know it's not always the case, but in some areas, these sort of Protestant Catholic thing begins to sound like Yankee Red Sox rivalry. You get people, this friend of mine, he's a Catholic, what am I doing with this guy? There are deeper problems than that, and there's economic problems, and there's problems coming out of Brexit, but go there. Don't let those problems stop you. They're not going to have anything to do with your trip to Belfast.
And this was actually my first time to Belfast. I grew up literally 90 miles south of the city, but 40 years ago, it was not a place that was on the tourist destination. And as I mentioned, I go back to Ireland a lot, but guess what? I'm there to visit my family, and there's an axis between my siblings, between Dublin and Waterford, which is from Dublin down south. It's not from Dublin up north. So this forced me to go to Belfast, and I'm delighted that I did. I had a great time. People were wonderful and kind and supportive and helpful, and I just think it's a fabulous destination.
And for you, Martin, did it shatter any, even though obviously you're very well educated with respect to Irish history and also knowing where Ireland is currently, both north and south, but did your experience in Belfast shatter any preconceived notions that even you had about the place? I think of not having been there before.
I think there's something extraordinary about being in the geography that you have heard about for decades. So when people said the Falls Road or the Shankill, what exactly is that, and where do they lie between each other? And you realize just how frickin' close those two things are. Yeah. So to actually walk that experience, and then you get a sense of the horrid intimacy of the Troubles. Now, of course, these places now have peace walls and stuff, and murals, and they have turned this conflict to some degree into a tourism experience. And I ask people about that. How do you feel about that? Because this is still a wound that isn't even close to healing for many people yet. And so most of the people that I asked that question was, better that than what we had before.
Nobody wants to go back.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to go back.
And so those dozen interviews, did you say they're going to drop, to use the lingo,
As
in
we use
January?
in the game, in the podcasting game, January. We're going to roll out a Belfast season, a little bit different in January. Yeah, I think we've got about a dozen episodes.
And would you like, or do you see in Irish Stew's future a road trip down the road?
As I mentioned, like proof of concept, it was a little bit of a shakeout. We realized some things we should have thought about sooner, other things we had to improvise a little bit, but yeah, we want bigger and better, and we want to head to the Midlands next year.
I have more to congratulate you on than this being your 100th episode, but you have been nominated, I believe, for 3 categories in the Irish Pod Awards that are going to take place in the Fair City, aka Dublin, in Ireland, on January 9th. Can you tell us more about that?
We're amazed and thankful. What are those categories again, Shelley?
I believe, I'll answer for Shelley.
Thank you. As I got into the question here.
The categories are society and culture. We're nominated in that category.
The short list, the famous short list.
We're also nominated as under the editor category, and here's where we give a shout out to my old college roommate, Bill Schultz, who has done a wonderful job editing our podcasts. And
he was our first interview.
And he was actually our very first interview.
Wow.
So our first interview on a podcast was about the podcast business. And it's a wonderful interview. If you want to know stuff about podcasting, Bill is the guy that you really want to talk to.
We should have brought his name up a lot sooner.
And then the other category is best duo, which kind of boomerangs back to your original question of, I never really realized that actually doing what we do is probably more difficult than being a singular interviewer. I think it's a source of strength, and so we cover for each other, but we have to be careful not to tread on each other's toes or over talk, or you can probably tell I'll get excited and start running. So I rely on John to give me a signal, hey, we need to move on from this or whatever. And we do this, we're usually typing online while we're actually interviewing. We send messages back and forth. So that's another behind the scenes kind of thing that we do.
But as far as the award, it's great for us to wave our flag. I don't know if we're expecting to go up on this stage and thank the Academy, but it's great to get this far. Arts and culture, or is it culture society?
Yeah,
that's great. That's a great category
culture,
for us. So we've had a few accolades along the way. This is a really nice one. Martin's planning to be there. I'm hoping to be there for it. Let's enjoy the short list while we have it.
Also, I think it speaks volumes when the Irish themselves acknowledge you.
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that.
I look to Martin over this. We know that's difficult to achieve.
And about that.
Same here.
Whether throwing our hat into that ring would be accepted, and I'm delighted it is, and I'm actually looking forward to going to Ireland and meeting the other podcasters that will be there that night. It'll be great crack.
Now, as you both touched upon, Martin, you being Dublin born, I'll forgive you for that. Not everyone can be lucky enough to be born in Wexford. And then John, you being born here in the States and being of Irish ancestry. For both of you, has your Irish identity changed by virtue of your experiences on Irish Stew Podcast?
I think for me, it helps clarify where I stand on the Irish spectrum. I have never made the mistake of going to Ireland and saying I'm Irish. I've always had that understanding that I look at it as, and actually a lot of it came from the Irish American writers and artists, the thinking of looking at Irish America as something distinct from, it's an identity distinct from an Irish identity, but it's connected. The connection there. It's not the same. It's connected, it's allied, but they're different, they're separate. So I'm fine with that, and it's just great to have the excuse of talking to people who normally wouldn't get on the phone with me and Martin, and just having great conversations. I feel it's like matured my view of the identity. It's certainly deepened my connections. I'm definitely more connected into Ireland than I am into New York in many ways. I probably have more people on my infamous Rolodex, who are from the global Irish community than anywhere else.
How about you, Martin?
I think, I'm just thinking of another episode right now, it's given me a greater appreciation for the epic story of the Irish. And we actually did have a couple of guests on from the Epic Museum. I think it was Patrick Green and Maurice
what a
Casey.
Fabulous museum.
And it's an extraordinary place. And I would never have visited it because I arrogantly probably thought, I understand the Irish story, but it forces you to kind of deepen that understanding. And actually, we're going to have Maurice on again now because he has a fabulous new book, which is about radicals living in Moscow in the 1920s. And one of them was an Irish radical, and the story's built around her experiences.
A woman, no less.
And a woman, no less. So it's an extraordinary book. And the point, I guess, what I'm really trying to make is remember that this is a teeny tiny little island. There's only 6 million people on there now. And all the corners of the world, and what Maurice will say is if you look hard enough at any point in history, you will find an Irishman cropping up, or Irish woman, in some kind of Zelig-like format, right? That there is an imprint of Irishness in all sorts of places where you never would have expected it. And that is just incredible. And so making those connections and understanding things in a deeper way, yes, it has changed me.
And on a final note, where do you see the future of Irish Stew Podcast going?
I think coming out of the pandemic and moving, we still do a lot of online interviews, but moving into in-person interviews like we're doing right now has been a great refresher and great opportunity to talk to people in their office or in a neutral territory. We did an episode at McSorley's old ale house, the oldest tavern in New York, with glasses.
With sawdust and all?
With sawdust and glasses clinking and a slightly more lubricated conversation as the hour went along. So that's opened up opportunities. And this idea of, besides just meeting people around here, but going to Ireland and going to other points in the diaspora and doing interviews, I think that's really opened things up for us.
Yeah, it's interesting, we're doing a little bit of an experiment right now because we're going to increase the cadence of the podcast. Now, I'm not saying we're going to always do that, but when we release the Belfast episodes, for example, we'll be releasing them every week. So there'll be a bigger, faster flow for a while, and then we'll probably go back to our normal 2-week cadence unless more money comes flowing in and we can up it a bit more.
Unless we can bring Shelley Ann in as title sponsor.
Or Shelley Ann as another host. Because
there you go. She's trying to get rid of me
Spread
already.
the wealth of the work.
Yes. Yeah, I need some female energy.
I'm happy to bring that. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Shelley Ann. That's been great. We had an opportunity to do this a little bit with News Talk FM, Irish radio, before and after the American election. So we saw the teamwork was good, and it was great to have you come here and take your time to talk to us.
No, not at all. Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be here to celebrate with you for your 100th episode anniversary.
It has been the nicest cross-examination that I have undergone, and just to make sure the listeners know, Shelley Ann Quilty-Lake indeed is an attorney and a very accomplished one. Thank you, Shelley Ann.
Not at all. I was tempted to swear you both in.
We rest our case.
At the beginning. But I believe you told the truth throughout.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.